This is the Argument Ninja Podcast, episode 18. Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Kevin Dunlop. I've been working hard on a number of projects, and I'm looking forward to talking more about that with you. But on today's show, I'm going to share an interview that I did with Jason Vidaurri over at the StoryHinge podcast. I was a guest on Jason's podcast earlier in the month, and he's very kindly allowed me to share the audio file of that interview with my listeners. So many thanks for that, Jason. The StoryHinge podcast is fairly new. You can find it at storyhinge.com. My interview is episode 30. The focus of the show is personal development and self-improvement through the sharing of stories that can inspire us to make positive changes in our lives. Jason Vidaurri's own story is very interesting. He works as a chemical engineer, but more importantly, story-wise, he was a member of the Mormon Church for many years. But he has since left the church, and in the process of making significant life changes, he was inspired to create this podcast as a platform for exploring this issue of how we make the decision to take our lives in different directions and what inspires us to make positive transformations in our lives. So Jason was a fan of the Argument Ninja podcast, and some of these critical thinking themes are really resonating with him right now. So he reached out to me for an interview, which I was very happy and grateful to do. I really want to applaud Jason for having the courage to make big changes in his own life. I know from experience, it's not always an easy thing to do. Now, because we cover a fair bit of ground in 1 hour, this episode is actually a good introduction to not only my story, why I quit my academic job to become an independent educator, but also an introduction to philosophy and the goals of critical thinking, why critical thinking is valuable and important, how our media environment is making it increasingly difficult to think critically for ourselves, what I think is the glaring omission in standard approaches to critical thinking education, and why the martial arts model of critical thinking that I'm developing at the Argument Ninja Academy is a particularly appropriate and useful model. So that's all in this episode. I am working very hard to finish up another episode in very short order, so be on the lookout for that. And before I give you this interview, I want to remind listeners that the goals and the project that I talk about in this episode, all of this is only possible through listener support. You can learn more about how to support my work and these projects at argumentninja.com/support, or you can sign up directly and become a patron at patreon.com/Kevin Dunlop. I still only have about half the recurring revenue I need to break even in terms of paying basic monthly bills, and I have no more savings to tap into, so your support is more important now than ever before. If you were ever thinking of becoming a patron, I could certainly use your support now. Okay, let me now pass the baton to Jason Vidaurri at storyhinge.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to his podcast. And you can support the Argument Ninja podcast, of course, by giving a rating and a review over at iTunes.
StoryHinge, Episode 30, Kevin Dunlop, Critical Thinking and Cognitive Biases.
And so I want to be able to claim ownership and responsibility for the beliefs and values that I hold. That I can give an account of why I believe in things I do, right? That goes a little bit deeper.
Welcome to StoryHinge, where we unfold more meaning and value in everyone's personal story. At StoryHinge, we explore foundational ideas and beliefs through diverse personal stories in order to discover more meaningful paths, greater happiness, and accelerated growth in one's life. We believe everyone has a beautiful story to grow. Now here's your host, Jason Vidaurri.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening. Today we're going to spend some time with Kevin Dunlop. Now, Kevin was a tenured professor and has more recently quit that profession to pursue some of his own work. And his work is centered in critical thinking and cognitive biases. I think this one's real fundamental to really the whole StoryHinge platform and the use of stories and listening to stories, and how do we break those things down and figure out what we're going to bring into our lives and what we don't want in our lives. And I think critical thinking is really foundational to all of that. So enjoy. There's a lot of meat on this bone. So excited today Today we have on Kevin Delaplante. Kevin, welcome to StoryHinge.
Thank you very much for having me, Jason.
Kevin, I'm real excited to hear your story and to come up to speed in the work you're doing today and to hear about critical thinking and cognitive biases in that kind of realm. But first, at StoryHinge, we like to go back in the past a little bit, hear a little bit about your story, about maybe some of those pivotal moments that led to where you're at today. So let's jump back there first.
Okay, well, thank you. And thanks again for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be on your show. So I guess what your audience should know is that I'm a philosopher by training. I taught in a philosophy department for a long time, 16 years. I was born here in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Went to school here, studied physics in my undergrad degree, was a real science nerd in my early years. Went on and studied philosophy in graduate school. I kind of discovered that my interests in science were actually more deeply philosophical interests, and my sort of foundational questions that I was interested in were more accurately described as philosophical. I mean, for example, if you're in a physics class and the question that's on your mind if you're a student is, how can we know what the laws of nature are at all? Like, what's the nature of a law of nature? What is it that constrains the motions of planets to follow the rules? What's the nature of the rules? And those are not the kind of questions that a physics professor is a ready answer for. These are questions in the philosophy of science, the philosophy of physics. And so the more I realized, oh gosh, I'm really interested in the philosophy of science. So that led me to take more philosophy courses in my undergraduate program. I did well in those. When I went on to grad school, it was in a philosophy program that specialized in the philosophy of science. I was at Western Ontario. And there the track was, I planned to try to get a tenure track job after graduating. I graduated there in 1997. And I did that. But in terms of storyline here, even when I was a graduate student, I was very aware that my interests were different from the typical academic interests because I kind of knew that I wanted to do something with the public. I wanted to do something about sharing the cool stuff that I was learning with a broader audience. And yes, I was interested in research and so forth, but my primary interest was communicating cool ideas, important ideas to a broader public. And in that respect, if there was a word for it, it would have been something like philosophy and science journalism, right?
Okay.
We have science journalism, right? There are people who can train for that, and that's a job. We don't really have philosophy journalism. But I thought that there was something missing there. So I kind of always thought that I wanted to get the training and education and the teaching experience. But I kind of thought that after I could be in academia for like 10 years, and then after 10 years, I would plan to do something different. I plan to branch out, maybe start writing books, maybe do something else, maybe do something with television or film or media, something like that.
Or I guess in your mind, at least back then, what were you trying to communicate? This idea of philosophy journalism, just these cool ideas and neat ideas that people don't think about. What part of that was intriguing for you?
Well, I suppose I was always attracted to these deeper philosophical questions, even when I was a kid and when I was a teenager, how to think about the big questions about right and wrong, about the meaning of life, about what exists and so forth, or practical things like what justifies the authority of the state and so on. So those are classic philosophical questions.
Okay.
Knowing that I cared a lot about that and that they mattered to people, that is, those questions, maybe not exactly those forms, but everyone has to deal with these issues at some point in their life when they choose between political parties or when someone's daughter gets pregnant and they have to decide what to do about this unborn fetus, or whether to decide to support a country in its war campaign, and so on. And all these questions matter to people, but we don't have a tradition in our public education system of equipping us to think critically about them. That is, we've got 2,500 years of philosophy and science that have been devoted to giving us tools for thinking about these bigger questions. But it's not taught. That is, there is no philosophy program that's part of the standard public school curriculum. So things like basic concepts in logic and argumentation aren't taught as such in school. And also, all the stuff we've learned about the nature of human reasoning, for example, is also not taught. So I think there's an enormous hole that has been avoided, or a gap that has left the public unequipped or poorly equipped to do the job that responsible citizenship requires of us. And that was part of the rationale for thinking about maybe we need some resources that are accessible to the public. And that was kind of the start of thinking about, these broader public education projects that I've been working on.
Okay. I want to jump to this just briefly here, I guess, in speaking about public education. You're saying that these things are not taught there. I guess, should they be taught there, or why are they not taught there?
Well, critical thinking is a kind of a buzzword in education. Every educational program, when you talk to the people who do curriculum development, will say that critical thinking goals are important for what they're doing. But the conception of critical thinking is oddly sort of disconnected from the study of it as such. So, for example, you're supposed to, in doing a science program, you're supposed to learn how to think critically about science. Or you're doing history or literature or geology or so forth. You're supposed to be learning skills, thinking skills, communication skills that can equip you to be a critical thinker about those domains. The goal is to try to build in this skill set intrinsically into the curriculum itself, without ever having to do, say, a special course on logic and argumentation, or a special course on good reasoning versus bad reasoning. But that's just a crazy choice, because there is, as I said, 2,500 years of highly influential thought about the nature of human reasoning, logic and argumentation, foundational thinking about ethics, politics, government, and so on, that now you would call political philosophy or the philosophy of science or and so on. That is been relegated to these academic silos and is not part of the curriculum, so that you can get to the point where you can finish high school and have no idea what a philosophy class should look like, because you've never been exposed to it. But you can't finish high school and have no idea what psychology class looks like, right? Or a math class, right?
Mm-hmm.
So something's going on here. And I think there's multiple theories about why it's been excluded. Some of them are kind of conspiratorial, in the sense of, like, one kind of semi-conspiratorial view is that teaching serious critical thinking skills is a kind of subversive act. That is, if you have the population actually equipped to think really critically about background assumptions and so forth, then that's not necessarily a net positive for a state that requires the citizens to be supportive of the state's goals.
Yeah, so kind of like you want almost obedience more than thinking too critically about what's going on, maybe?
Well, if you think about the goals of the public education system, it means the state is funding the educational program, right? And what's their goal? It's always been the case that public education has fulfilled a certain social function. You have to decide what you're going to teach the population. And that's basically, the question is, what do we want? What does this state, the country, want all of its citizens to be exposed to in terms of ideas, concepts, and skills? Among all those choices, what they're going to do, naturally, is pick ideas and concepts and skills that support the mission, the functioning, and the goals of the state.
Okay, that makes sense.
So otherwise, why do it at all, right? So what you want to have is people who can be productive in the workforce. You want to have people, especially if you have like a democratic, capitalist culture, you need people with a certain set of autonomous thinking skills, right? Be able to do creative communication, writing, and so forth, and thinking, because your country depends on innovation and creativity to create new technologies, for example, to compete against other countries and economic, So there is a kind of agenda for what the skill set should be. I think, just to sum up, I think the idea is that what they're doing is trying to create a labor force of a certain kind. And the goal is also to create good citizens. If you think of public education in those terms, as the goal is to create a certain kind of labor force and to create citizens that will serve the interests of the country well, then that helps to explain some of the way things are done. Because critical thinking skills per se, they're not connected to agendas in that same way, right? So you could have, think about what a critical thinking program during like the slave culture times or other times of serious racial segregation, right?
Yeah.
Imagine a culture that was teaching philosophical concept of, how to challenge ethical and political assumptions of the status quo and offer arguments and defend them and appeal to arguments to defend them and support that kind of critical investigation. Would that be supportive of a system that
enslaved,
Yeah, makes sense.
of, forms of state power, So maybe that's part of the story. There's also a story about like American individualism and pragmatism and so on to be told there. But for whatever reasons, the fact is that there's this gap, and it's not being filled in the right way, I think.
Okay.
So a lot of my motivation has been trying to diagnose what I think is a better way of approaching this subject of teaching critical thinking skills, and also trying to come up with some practical solutions for doing that.
Okay. Let me step back a little bit here and make sure we're clear on what is this philosophy? What is critical thinking? Can you kind of define that and lay that out a little clearer for us so someone unfamiliar with those concepts has an understanding?
Yeah, well, I think people are unfamiliar with it. And so you do need to say these things. It is tough, though, because like philosophy, I support a sort of classical conception of philosophy as, the word philos means love and Sophia means wisdom. So the classical definition is philosophy is a love of wisdom. And a philosopher is a lover of wisdom. So Socrates is the one who coined this term, and he used it in this way. It's specifically aimed at a deeper understanding of foundational questions than what we normally have to deal with on a daily basis. And also it deals with questions that aren't easily answered by ordinary empirical methods. So that you can't really do an empirical experiment, for example, to resolve these issues easily. So they tend to be conceptual questions that deal with foundational issues that require a certain way of approaching them in order to get any traction on them. And in the history of the West, the tool set that we've used to talk about these questions has been argumentation. It's about offering reasons to have one opinion or another on the topic. And those reasons you're given are public, right? So that everyone can hear them, can share them, and then they can be open to criticism. And then you develop standards for what counts as good reasons versus bad reasons. So that's the origin of logic and argumentation as a tool for foundational thinking, where your goal is the pursuit of wisdom. And I buy that definition of philosophy. I think that's fine. Critical thinking is tied to this, right? But I would say the goals there, it's more helpful to think about the goals of critical thinking. And I think that there are two distinct kinds of goals. One goal is to improve the quality of our thinking. Part of our thinking is about having beliefs about the world. And one way in which we can improve that is if we would like to believe more true things and fewer false things, right? So we like to have a closer match between our beliefs and the world itself. And we would like our decisions to be rational and effective and actually serve our goals. So we can improve the quality of our beliefs and improve the quality of our actions and choices. So that's one part of being a critical thinker. The another part is captured by phrases like, I want to learn to think for myself. I want my kid to grow up to become an independent critical thinker. Now, what does that mean? It's something about having autonomy. Like, I want to be able to think for myself, arrive at an understanding of issues that comes from me. That's a product of a reasoning process that I've gone through. And so I want to be able to claim ownership and responsibility for the beliefs and values that I hold, right? So that I'm not just echoing or parroting what some institution tells me to believe, or what my peers say, or what religion says, or the media says, that I can give an account of why I believe the things I do, right? That goes a little bit deeper than simply reporting what my peer group is supposed to say, right? So that's the notion of being an independent thinker. So if you think about those as two goals, where one part of it is improving the quality of our thinking, and then the other part is learning to think for ourselves, that's, I think, is a nice way of framing what the goals of critical thinking are. So that then anything that helps to support those goals becomes part of the critical thinking tool set.
Okay.
So that gets into the idea of like, what are some different ways? What are some obstacles to critical thinking? And then it gets into the details about how you would actually go about improving these things.
Okay. Before we jump into any details, I want to maybe flip this around and say, I guess in your view, what are the consequences of not being a critical thinker, of not going down that path? And just maybe someone out there saying, hey, I don't need to be critical, think about stuff. My reaction to things and the way I've lived my life, I haven't been that critical about things, and it seems to work for me. I guess, what would your response be?
Yeah. Well, I actually think that most people think that they think about things as much as one reasonably should. That is, it's a kind of cognitive bias where most people think that they've invested as much thought and time and effort into thinking about an issue as is reasonable to do so. So on my measure, maybe someone's a very superficial thinker who's never hasn't spent enough time thinking about these things. No one thinks that way about themselves.
That's funny. That is true.
Right? There is variation about how much time and effort people are naturally disposed to think about issues. These are personality traits, in fact. There's a personality trait called need for cognition. It's a trait that describes how much it matters to you that you've thought about the issue. For example, voting. How important is it that you've read up on the platforms of the candidates and tried to understand pro and con things? If you're high on need for cognition, you'll be inclined to want to do that more than someone who's low on that trait. So there is natural variation along here, right?
Yeah.
And so, because people differ. The people who are really high on these things tend to go into fields like science and philosophy, right? So it's a self-selected group. I'm certainly high on that rank there. But are there arguments that people should be more critical, should spend more time? Well, it's actually a kind of interesting question about how much is important. So your first question is, what are the consequences of not doing this enough? And it's hard not to read the news over the past 2 years and not hear a lot of people lamenting what they think is, neglectful thinking on the part of the public or whatnot, that we make judgments about who we want to vote for or what issues we support based on tribal affiliations or intuitive feelings, or we're swayed easily that we're not good at that kind of rational critical analysis. And so one of the consequences is if the quality of your beliefs is low, it means you believe a lot of false things, more false things than you have to. I think that there are consequences for believing false things. Like, you didn't do the things to prepare your house for winter, and all of a sudden you're paying a lot of, so the practical outcomes for this, but also false beliefs about your own happiness, about what's important in your life. People are very poor often at making judgments about what will make themselves happy or make other people happy. In fact, there's a whole set of cognitive biases that have to do with people's misperceptions about how they'll feel about certain future states, So it does matter to people, even if they're not as aware of it as they should be. So I almost never have to spend any time selling the idea that critical thinking is a public good too. Everyone I talk to thinks that that's true, right? So in their heads, everyone can imagine contexts in which they would like to have a deeper understanding of an issue, or they know people who aggravate them because they think that they make poor judgments and bad decisions, and they wish that they had those skills, right? So I've never had a problem with trying to convince people that critical thinking skills are important. But it is, when you try to get down to what people mean by that, right? It can be tricky because we haven't spent a lot of time thinking explicitly about what that means.
Okay. You remind me as you're sharing some of that, as I served a mission in Chile. And as a missionary for the Mormon Church, you go around talking to people all day long. It's pretty much what you do. And I remember one of the things at the end of those 2 years of serving, I remember thinking about how many different philosophies of life I heard from different people. Their worldviews, whatever way they were living. But one constant that seemed pretty consistent is that everybody believed that they were right. No matter how different those different views were, they all thought they were right. And so it kind of reminded me of something that you're saying there. How do we know if we've really done enough work, enough critical thinking on certain topics? If we have that bias already that we think we've done enough.
That's a very good question, right? So how do you know that the quality of your reasoning has improved? The quality of your decision-making has improved? How do you know that your own thinking is more independent than it was before, right?
Yeah.
I think it's easy for us maybe to make judgments about our own personal histories better than other people's. So if you think about what that feels like when you were younger, when you reflect upon your younger self, it's easy for us to think, oh, when I was young, I was so naive, or I didn't know, if I knew then what I know now, I would have been smarter. I would have made better judgments.
Yeah.
So we know what that feels like, right? I can do that for my 20-year-old self very easily. We can all do that. But how do we know now, how to, let's give a concrete example. I've been reading up about what to do about immigration right now in the USA. How do I evaluate the quality of my reasoning about that right now and then compare it, right? There's not an obvious way to do that. But conceptually, I think one of the basic principles for critical thinking is, do you understand the reasons behind the different viewpoints that people hold? What you can do is test for the depth of one's understanding by simply asking to give an explanation for why people hold the views they do. And even the ones that you agree with, say you support tighter immigration policies, you imagine yourself having to justify that viewpoint to someone who's going to ask you, why do you believe that?
Mm-hmm.
And how hard is that for you to give an answer to that? If it feels hard to do that, if you stop, and a lot of people will stumble on this, right? Because they feel confident about the judgment. When you're asked to explain themselves, that's a harder thing to do. They're not asked to do it very often. They feel a sense of discomfort and uncertainty. And then as a consequence, they tend to reduce the confidence of their judgment. This is a demonstrable effect, in fact, that if you ask someone to give an explanation for the opinion they hold, and then they struggle with that, and then ask them to rank how confident they are about it, you'll see this measurable drop. So it's not hard to demonstrate to people through questioning and to yourself how deep one's understanding is. And then if you can think about understanding opponent's view, someone, for example, you believe that border security should be tighter or immigration should be tighter. And then there's people who think that we should be keeping the doors as open as possible. And that the threats that the one side thinks are real threats, the other side thinks are not. Can you give an account of why people believe that? That would be plausible to someone on the other side. So these are questions about testing your understanding. And the way you do this is actually have conversations with people, or you do a little reading, So these are the natural things that we do. What our natural biases are, though, to not do that. The comfortable thing to do is to look for information that tends to support the views we already have. That's a form of confirmation bias. And we tend to ignore or dismiss or otherwise devalue the opinions of those who have beliefs that run against ours. And so it takes a lot more work to get to the point where you're sympathetically considering and realistically considering what the other side's reasons actually are in a way that would be recognizable to them if you were to give them back to them. So these are sort of standard tests, actually, of one's understanding. Generally speaking, the more that you can do, when you walk up to someone and be able to tell them the reasons why they hold these they do in a way that they would recognize, and they nod their head and they go, that's exactly why I hold the view I do. Then you've done something. Then you know something that other people don't know. Now, I don't know how to come up with any kind of absolute scale of knowledge here, but it is possible to make relative judgments, comparative judgments about what you know now versus what you knew before. And you can take two people and through questioning and investigation, come to a judgment, you realize, this person knows more about that subject than the other person does. We can make those judgments. So there is a way to do it.
Okay. So that's good. You've given us a picture of this critical thinking, the main aims of it to basically improve our quality of our beliefs and our judgments and decisions, and also to help us to learn to think for ourselves, to be able to claim that ownership and responsibility for those beliefs. Let's jump into these cognitive biases and how that fits into that. What I found, at least with your work, is that's more of a unique approach where you're basically taking cross disciplines and not just focus on the philosophy and the argument side of it and the reasoning side of it. But now you're saying, but there's also cognitive biases.
Yeah. It is a really important part of what I do. And it's been a challenging thing. It's something that I've come to only gradually over time, because the fact is that in the philosophy tradition that I come out of, there hasn't been a whole lot of discussion of these psychological factors that influence how amenable people are to reason and argumentation, or why people resist efforts to persuade them. There is the whole tradition of rhetoric, that goes back to the Greeks, is the art of persuasive speech. But philosophy has a history of thinking that rhetoric isn't philosophy. Rhetoric is about persuasion for its own sake. And the problem with persuasion for its own sake, they believe it has a corrosive effect on the search for sort of truth and wisdom. So Plato famously had a very hard line against this, where if someone taught skills in persuasive speech and argumentation and oratory that was like psychologically compelling, and you taught it as such, for those reasons, for those effects, he thought that was a problem, because you could end up teaching people how to make arguments seem to be compelling when they're not. So there was this clear difference in his head between persuasion and persuasion for good reasons. And persuasion for good reasons is what the philosophical pursuit is all about, right? So there was this split between philosophical pursuit, which developed a culture that nurtured logic and argumentation as tools for doing this kind of work. And then the kind of psychology that ordinary people in the public context are more subject to was sort of left up to other disciplines to deal with. And that's remained the case, frankly, for most of its 2,500-year history. And the story takes a new turn in the second half of the 20th century with the rise of various disciplines in social psychology and cognitive science that study human reasoning for the first time in a way that has revealed principles that the human brain uses, the human mind uses to make judgment and make decisions that often violate standard rules for good reasoning. And this has earned people Nobel Prizes, where I'm talking about the cognitive bias literature that came out of work from the early 70s. It's flourished. It's a huge industry, in fact. And we've learned a ton in the past 45 years about how the mind works and how human reasoning works. This is a knowledge that is critical to understanding what it means to be a critical thinker in the 21st century. Because not only do we now have a better understanding about how our brains actually work, how we actually form beliefs and make decisions, and we have a better understanding of the obstacles to critical thinking that natural biases pose. But we also live in a culture in which these biases make us vulnerable to manipulation and persuasion by third parties. For example, advertisers and marketers and speechwriters and spin doctors. And there's a whole large industry that over the 20th century has grown to enormous proportions, where you've got people whose job it is to manipulate human psychology in a way that causes us to believe or do or make choices and change our attitudes in ways that conform to some goal that some other party has, not our personal goals, but someone else's goals. So we live in an environment, and the term I use for this is this sort of matrixy language of the persuasion matrix. We're surrounded every day by messaging that comes from our cell phones and from television and news media and so forth. We can't escape it now. That's been structured, intentionally designed to take advantage of the cognitive biases, to exploit the cognitive biases that we've come to have a deeper understanding about over the past 45 years. That means that the environment that we navigate every day is more hostile to critical thinking than it has been in the past. And we've come to realize that now. So now, if you're going to have a critical thinking education program, if you ignore this, you're dropping the ball entirely. What you have to have is a program that both teaches principles of logic and good reasoning that have a long history, and principles of the psychology of persuasion and principles of the psychology of belief and judgment that we've come to know more recently, and bring these together. Think about the analogy of having like a target that you're shooting for. The thing that you're shooting for is the goal, right? You want your beliefs to be more accurate, for example, so they're on target, then that's the goal. But we have all these factors that are causing us to miss the target, like the wind speed, for example, or whatnot, or just imagine some other range of things. And if you ignore the existence of those factors, or what you have, in fact, are people standing beside you, nudging the arrow. Let's say you're an archer and you're trying to shoot and hit the target. It used to be that you had, you got the target and you got your bow and whatever, and it takes skill and effort and practice to get that target reliably. It takes time and effort to discipline our thoughts and our reasoning and so forth. But now we have people all around us nudging us, trying to make us miss, right? Or hit other targets. And we don't even realize they're there.
And so what are some of these big things that are nudging us, these biases that are out there that maybe people are not familiar with?
Well, let me think. I mean, there are, in fact, hundreds of them. Anybody in your audience can go to Wikipedia and type in list of cognitive biases, and you'll have a list of a couple hundred at least. Each of them has their own name. Each of them comes out of some discipline in psychology or social psychology or whatnot. Some standard ones are, for example,
well, the more prevalent ones, perhaps, maybe the ones that you see affecting this, critical thinking the most.
I mentioned one already. It's confirmation bias. It's kind of one of the granddaddies of these because it's so deep, and it's just a bias where we're given information that's provided to us. We're inclined to seek out information and remember information that supports our preconceptions and our expectations, and we ignore or deny or undermine sources that would go counter to them. It's a kind of tunnel vision. One of a way of characterizing a lot of these biases is that they funnel our attention. So imagine like a spotlight, the spotlight in the street lamp that has a little circle of light on the street. What these biases do is they focus our attention on certain types of information that are focal. So we get triggered in a way that does this automatic, when in fact the normatively right answer or a better answer is lying somewhere outside the space, somewhere in the darkness that we're not paying attention to. And so what we have to do then is find ways of expanding or broadening the types and kinds of information that we're paying attention to in order to find the right answers that are somewhere that used to be hidden in the dark. So it's a hard thing to do. I'll give you an example of a bias that is exploited, for example. So we tend to remember things that are vivid, that are presented to us in a vivid way. And we mistake, so if a question is asked for us, like, how likely is this thing to happen? For example, if I ask you, how likely is it that a female is going to be assaulted on campus when they're walking home at night on a university campus? What's the probability of someone being attacked? What happens is that's a really hard question to answer, right? Unless you have the stats handy, which you don't. So what happens, though, is that the question that our brain answers is actually, how easy is it for me to imagine, vividly recall an event like that, where a woman is attacked walking across campus? If it's easy for me to vividly imagine that, my answer is going to be that it's more likely to be the case than for someone who has a hard time imagining that. So we're substituting a judgment about the probability of some event happening with a judgment about how easy it is to visualize or recall a vivid instance of an event of that type. So this is called the availability bias. And it can be exploited. If you're doing a lottery, those Lotto 649s or whatever, or Powerball, right? Where the winner, where a lottery is by its nature an extraordinarily unlikely event to win. Like it's, the chances of winning these things are incredibly small.
Yeah, it reminds me of a statistician saying, I've looked at the odds, and your odds of winning are the same whether you play or don't play the game. as an example of what the odds are.
Okay. The odds are low. So what do the Powerball people do, or the clearinghouse? They do these ads, right, where you go to the door and you knock and they record it, and you have a big production where you've won $30 million, and they bring these people out in front of the media and they give these giant checks. They hold up a giant check that has their name written on it in bold type and the amount of their winnings. And they put this all over their advertising campaigns. Now, what's the point of that? Why would they not just give them normal size check, right? It's the same thing, right? Why? Because what you want is for people in the audience who are viewing this to think that they have a better chance of winning than not, that their chances of winning are higher. So how do you get people to think that their chances of winning are higher? You exploit the availability bias and say, how can I make this image of winning, of someone winning with their name attached to a huge number, very vivid and memorable? How do I make it so that when they think about winning, it's easy to recall examples like that? And that's exactly what the purpose of the advertising campaign is, to exploit the availability effect so that people are easily able to come up with examples like this. And that, by its nature, increases their judgment of the probability of winning.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said something interesting earlier. I wanted to dive into a little bit more. You said that's, I guess, because of we've gained understanding about psychology and how our brains work, that these things are used to exploit. Like your example you just shared, that. So it kind of raises the need for us to be more equipped to handle that. I guess is that a real perception because we've gained more understanding of how our brain works and stuff, that people are using these things against us?
It's a very serious problem. I mean, depend how you frame it, because if you're purely, economically oriented and you think the market, whatever the market comes up with to influence consumers is by its nature justified and okay, as long as it's not outright lying, for example, then you might think that this is just the way things are. So we have advertisers who are very good at making us want to buy things. Well, the economy needs people to buy things. So is that so bad, right? But if you think of it in terms of, say, critical thinking goals, then this is a serious problem, because this kind of activity does systematically undermine those critical thinking goals. It undermines the quality of our beliefs, undermines the quality of our decisions, and it takes power away from us to make our own choices. the question about the ethics of this kind of manipulation have not been discussed properly. They have not been subject to much public discussion at all. Because, well, the people who do it don't want it to be widely known, the methods that are used. But I think it's a growing issue. And one of the things that I'm working on with my stuff is talking more openly about the ethics of persuasion. There was a recent guest on Sam Harris's podcast who talked about persuasion technologies that are built into our internet experience and things that are designed to make us want to stay on sites longer, to click more often. And I'll give you an example that is discussed in that podcast. So on Twitter, you have this thing where if you open up Twitter, there's a little red number that shows up. You have to be on Twitter to see this. And it tells you how many retweets or replies or shares or so forth or likes of your stuff has happened since the last time you checked. You turn on the app, and then there's a delay between the time when the screen is on and between the time when that number comes up. So what's the point of the delay? Well, this is known as the slot machine effect, where when you pull a slot machine, at Vegas or a casino, part of the anticipation is the tumbler's spin, right? And click, there's one, click, there's two, click, there's three. They could give you the same information just by hitting a button, and then the three different values pop up instantaneously. Then you would know whether you won or not, right? But that's not as fun. So they're building in the anticipation, like those little dopamine hits, right? By building in that. And so there's wait, boom, wait, boom, wait, boom. So that feeling of anticipation increases the positive response your brain has to the new bit of information when it's delivered to you. And they build that in intentionally to make people want to check more often. Now we know that people check their emails like 150 times a day. And young people, that number is higher. I mean, the time that they spend on their phones checking things is enormous. And a lot of that has been engineered, right? A lot of that behavior has been intentionally designed for that outcome. So if we want to talk about ways of spending our time better or valuing our time or the positive or negative effects of social media on us, then we have to talk about the fact that the companies that we're using, the products, Facebook and Twitter and so forth and Google, are using techniques that are designed to support this kind of behavior. And we're not having those kind of conversations.
Yeah, out there. Huh? Well, so Kevin, let's hear about the work you're doing now. And my understanding is you stepped away from being a professor a couple of years ago. Yeah. And now you're doing something else. Let's hear about that.
Sure. Yeah. So for 16 years, I was a professor at Iowa State University, teaching philosophy of science courses mostly. And then I started producing videos for my courses back in the early mid-2000s. And that led me to the idea that, I could maybe produce videos for the public. That is, these videos I'm doing for my students could be put up on a site and be accessed. So they were part of courses I was doing for my logic and scientific reasoning class and my critical thinking class. So this led to a site that I put up called the Critical Thinker Academy, which essentially hosts a bunch of video tutorials on various topics in critical thinking, logic and argumentation, fallacies, cognitive biases, and so on. So I was working on that, and while I was teaching, and at some point I realized, if I really wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to do something like a bigger scale, but work with the public in a more direct, full-time way, I kind of had to leave my job and strike out on my own. So I actually had planned to do this for a while, but I finally got to do it back in 2015. Was when I actually resigned and moved back to Canada here. And since then, I've been working on creating content for Critical Thinker Academy, but I also started a podcast last summer because I was thinking about if I could imagine a teaching resource that was designed to help people develop these critical thinking skills. How would I design that? And what I have so far, what I had with the Academy so far was essentially an audiovisual critical thinking textbook. It's like videos, bite-sized videos are structured. And so that's good. And I like that. And it's a unique resource online. But there's a difference between that and actually training in developing the skills, because you can't learn these skills out of a book. And the point here is that critical thinking involves a sort of performative element. There's a skills associated. It's manifested in how we speak and the choices we make and our behaviors, not just the thoughts we have, right? But we do things with it. And how do you develop those skills? So I prefer to think of it as a type of intelligent, skilled action, in which case it's more like learning to be good at a sport or a game like chess, or becoming a good athlete, or becoming a good parent or a good scientist, right? Those are things that require practice and repetition and feedback and mentoring in order to develop those skills. The model that I've been using recently for a model of teaching and learning that I think is particularly useful is martial arts. So martial arts instruction has a lot of features that are really attractive if you were to take that model of skill development and see if you could sort of extract key principles and then use them to design a critical thinking curriculum. So that was the origin of the podcast I started last summer, the Argument Ninja podcast, which is about laying out the conceptual foundations for this new approach to critical thinking education that is inspired by martial arts training principles. Because there is a long history of thinking about the art of argumentation as a kind of verbal judo, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can think about it, well, that was a great move you made, or, there's tactics and strategy involved with that. But if you combine that, so there's a long history of that. But if you combine that with knowledge about human psychology, so you understand the cognitive biases that govern our thinking and judgment, if you can use that information and then combine that with real knowledge about logic and argumentation, about sort of what good reasoning actually looks like, then you have this powerful skill set about how to communicate with people in a way that's effective in the real world, given all of our psychological dispositions and habits and resistances and so on. How can you be more effective in that domain? And so for me, it's about fusing together training in standard principles of logic and argumentation that have a long history with this modern understanding of human psychology in a way that creates something that has never been done before. Because the former stuff has been taught by philosophers and logicians for many years, and then the other stuff has been taught by people who do rhetoric and psychology and in applied fields of advertising, for example. And these two domains often don't overlap at all.
That's cool.
That's what I'm going for.
Okay. No, that sounds really exciting. I have listened to some of the podcasts. I really enjoy it up to this point. I'm not quite all the way caught up, but I will be pretty soon. And I found a lot of that. And also, I guess, as you're explaining that, because it seems like you can use all that knowledge and that ability to do what, almost manipulate if you wanted to. What does, I guess, the ethics come into that? Is that part of the martial arts?
It is. It's explicitly built into it. So, of course, but here's a case where, just like martial arts, right, you can teach someone skills to hurt and maim people and kill people, right? You teach that skill set. But you also teach, as part of any traditional martial art, you teach them that that's not a good thing, right? You teach them that's not a value that we're trying to communicate in this program. We're teaching something else. So if you just look at the examples of what are the basic fundamental principles for jiu-jitsu or taekwondo or wrestling or whatnot, you're not trying to hurt people. In fact, often the goals of these traditional martial arts are loftier. They go beyond even fighting, combat, right? These are lifestyle goals, or depending on how the martial art views its own history. So similarly here, what we have in my program, or the idea behind it, is a set of critical thinking values that are foundational. And those values have an ethical component to them. Namely, if I believe it's a good thing that people are able to think for themselves, then anything that undermines that ability there's a prima facie case that's bad for them. And if there are factors that undermine the quality of our beliefs and our judgments and reasoning, that's, all other things being equal, that's bad for them. So we're trying to develop tools that allow people to be better advocates for their own situation. So you're teaching a form of logical self-defense. You're teaching a form of personal empowerment, right? So you can use these tools in order to become better advocates for your own causes and things that you care about, right? But you're also teaching, through that, you're becoming more aware of the reality of these forces that are acting upon us. Because if you're not aware of them, you can't defend against them, right? You can't take steps. This does give you the ability, if you wanted to go to the dark side, absolutely. You can go to the dark side and make a killing to manipulate people, but that's always been the case, right? You teach someone how to use a gun or a weapon or whatever, they can use it for self-defense and responsibly, or they can use it for nefarious goals.
Yeah.
So we certainly do teach in the curriculum that I'm trying to design, we teach moral reasoning and moral argumentation and moral psychology, but at the same time, we're reinforcing these fundamental values that are essentially pro-critical thinking values.
Well, wonderful. You shared a lot of value with us here. A couple of questions here before we wrap up. For someone else that's maybe, because I kind of see you as taking a leap there. You had a nice profession going, but you stepped out of that to do this. What advice would you have for someone else that's kind of maybe on that edge, thinking about, I have this thing I've been wanting to do for a long time. Not sure if I should do it. Any advice for someone in that situation?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting situation for academics because I left a job after 20 years in academia. It was one of the cushiest jobs you can have. It's a tenured, relatively well-paying job at a reputable institution, and I had great colleagues and peers. I had a good experience there. So no one leaves those jobs.
Yeah.
People who tell you about their academic dropout decision, usually they're in the very early stages. They're either graduate students who've decided that they're not going to pursue a tenure track career, or they've been trying to get a tenure track job and struggling over the years. They're lecturers, for example. It's become a frustrating experience for them. Or they're pre-tenure. They've been in there for 2 or 3 years. And they're just not, the culture of academia is not what they're well suited for. And so there's lots of people who are talking about that these days. No one leaves after 20 years to do this, especially when you don't have a job, when you're going from, $70,000 a year to whatever I was making, fraction of that, right? So what I did, of course, is I had a savings account that I had accumulated because of retirement benefits. So I had this little nest egg I had accumulated that I could use as a kind of runway for taking this risk. But it was a risk, and it remains a risk. And people should be cautioned about making any kind of quick judgment about these things. What I can say is that the opportunities for pursuing, especially people with academic training and teaching experience, that skill set is unique in the workforce. There's very few people who can match that particular combination of skills. And there's a need, and if you're willing to learn something about the new technologies that are available for hosting your work online or doing podcasts or making videos or writing ebooks or whatnot, and maybe with your background doing things that involve consulting or speaking gigs, there are opportunities here for people to find a new audience. And there are lots of people who are interested in what you know. You might think that your background in whatever it is, chemical engineering, is too technical to be of interest to a general public. But there are tons I can tell you, there are tons of things that someone like that background, or physics, or biology, or history, or anything, sociology, that you could find a way of packaging and communicating that information to an audience in a way that you're meeting their interests, their needs. And if you can find a way of doing that in a way where there's an exchange of value going on, people will pay you for that. So there are opportunities here that are growing every year as the technology advances. And I would encourage people to consider that, and you can always do this stuff as a side gig. You don't have to leave your job. Keep your job, but do something that you can do on nights and weekends and over the summer. And who knows? You may find yourself making a quarter or a third of your salary just off of these side gigs. And then that tells you that there's a market for this.
Great. All right, Kevin, any last words for the audience? Someone out there maybe looking around their life, kind of seeing what the next thing might be, and any last words for them before we part?
I would say, especially if you're thinking about making big changes in your life, don't neglect the important relationships in your life. Friends and family are extremely important. They can help to support changes in one's life in a way that if you don't have that kind of support, it can be very tough. So I would say that people who are considering a shift or a new path or so forth, don't do it alone. Don't do it. You share your concerns and your interests with other people, And the more you do that, I think you find the more opportunities will open up, and you're also connecting with people in a way that binds you to them even further. And so I do think that I would say, don't neglect your relationships, because that's the thing that keeps the ship upright, even when the waters are sort of choppy.
All right. Wonderful. Beautiful. Now, I forgot to mention earlier, but I will add your links for Argument Ninja podcast and Critical Thinker Academy. I'll make sure that's on the web.
I have a home base now. It's kevindelaplante.com. There's criticalthinkeracademy.com for those video tutorial site, and then argumentninja.com is for the podcast.
Well, Kevin, I really enjoyed this time with you. It's been really wonderful and got my mind thinking, as my guests always seem to do. And I look forward to following your work as you continue on. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. This has been a lot of fun, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk.
All right. Thanks for listening. For those of you that want to connect with Kevin, he can be found at kevindelaplante.com or at the criticalthinkeracademy.com or Argument Ninja Podcasts. And I'll put links on that on the website, and both on the podcast and on the website, so you'll have access to that. Just wanted to mention that again. And time for Jay's top takeaways. On this, I have the big thing on this for me is just the fundamental part, or the fundamental component of this, in critical thinking and understanding cognitive biases in terms of building better foundations for ourselves. Now, at StoryHinge, we're basically using personal stories of other people, as one of those ways to get ideas, to be exposed to more things in order to unleash more of your own potential. But how do you process those different stories? And I think we're on episode 30 on this one. And I know for myself, I've already heard different stories, maybe even some contradictory ideas out there. So how do you work through that? How do you process some of that and figure out, okay, this is right for me, or this is not, or I'm going to bring this into my life, or this one I'm not. And I think critical thinking and understanding biases is kind of fundamental to understanding ourselves and understanding how we want to build our life and our path. So, I mean, that's the main takeaway I get from this. I really enjoyed discussing with Kevin and seeing some of his work and seeing it grow and develop. Education, things like this. We have a great opportunity to have more of this out there, and I hope people are doing these types of things more. And maybe this is a little bit of some of my view on some of our traditional education, and that it misses some of these things. And although I value all that education I had, I think there's some places that it misses, or there's some places we can do it better. And so I really appreciate Kevin and the work he's doing on that. So I encourage you, if this appeals to you and you want to learn more about that, to go ahead and reach out and support his work. And we're going to keep doing things along this line as well to give us better tools and better ways for us to think and figure out how we want to build our lives. So that's kind of my main takeaway on this. I just want to encourage everyone to keep taking steps forward wherever you're at. It really doesn't matter where you're at. It's just the direction you're going, and that you take a step, no matter how big or small. Just keep taking steps towards where you want to go. And, I want you to have a great week. Of course, as always, please subscribe to the podcast, share it with a friend. This work's going to keep going. We're going to be exploring some different formats here in the future, besides just interviews with guests. So I'll keep that as part of this, but we'll start introducing other stories, other more global stories as we move forward. And I think there'll be a real appeal for that. So I look for changes coming up. Things are moving along here at StoryHinge. Appreciate your support. You guys have a great week.
Thank you for sharing with us at StoryHinge. We hope this time together has added more goodness to your journey. Until next time, onward and upward, and may your own story continue to grow more beautiful.